She was sitting on her porch, still, quiet, sipping tea, when two deputies stormed up like she was a threat. No weapon, no crime, just black, elderly, and unbothered. But when her son arrived in a black SUV and flashed his badge, everything changed. Because this wasn't just a mistake, this was his mother, and they nearly arrested her. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. They say time moved slower in Meadowville, Georgia, but that wasn't quite true. Time didn't just crawl, it settled. It pressed itself into the red clay, soaked into the porch wood, and curled up in the corners of window panes like dust refusing to be swept away. On Maple Street, where every cracked sidewalk told a story and every leaning mailbox marked a generation, time wasn't just passing, it was bearing witness. This was a town where summer heat wrapped around your shoulders like a sermon, and the cicadas sang like clockwork choirs. Every dusk, every season, without fail. The breeze didn't rush, it strolled. The trees didn't sway, they nodded like elders in pews, quiet but present. And in that town, on that street, sat a house. Weather, chipped, proud, a two-story relic with peeling paint, rusting gutters, and a wraparound porch that caught the last of the day's light like it was holding on to something sacred. The Jefferson house had stood there for more than half a century, long enough to see Meadowville change its clothes, its name, and its soul. It had seen new roofs replace old ones, families move in and out like gusts of wind, and kids grow tall enough to outpace the fences that once held them in. But the house remained, not out of stubbornness, but out of purpose. It belonged. And on that porch, under a ceiling fan that clicked in lazy circles, sat Clara Jefferson, 76 years old and as immovable as the earth beneath her. She wasn't there to watch. She wasn't there to pass time. She was there because this porch, this space was hers. Every plank beneath her feet had a memory nailed to it. Every breeze that brushed past her cheek carried echoes of names long gone but never forgotten. And in the low light of early evening, Clara sat with her back straight, her lavender dress smooth over her knees, and a chipped ceramic mug in her hand. Her eyes, deep brown and sharp as ever, scanned the street not with fear, but with knowing. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. To anyone walking by, she might have looked like just another elderly woman in just another aging house. But that porch was no accident. That chair wasn't just furniture. Clara's stillness wasn't passive. It was practiced. This was the same porch where she'd nursed her husband through his final days, where she'd braided her daughter's hair before school, where she'd prayed when her son joined the military, and where she'd wept quietly the first time a for sale sign went up on a black family's lawn down the block. The world had tried to move on without her, had tried to change the rules, the neighbors, the pace, but Clara had not moved. Because sometimes presence is protest, sometimes survival is louder than words, and sometimes just sitting, deliberately, publicly, peacefully, is the boldest thing a woman can do. On that porch in Meadowville, time wasn't the only thing standing still. Clara Jefferson was, too. And she was not moving, not for anyone. Clara hadn't always needed to be this still. There was a time when the neighborhood was alive with voices that sounded like hers. Back then, porches weren't quiet. There were stages, places where card games were played, songs were sung, and warnings were whispered long before they became headlines. She remembered when her husband, Walter, used to sit with their son Elijah on the very same porch steps, teaching him how to polish his shoes and speak like a man who knew his worth. She remembered when Sunday dresses dried on backyard lines and neighbors left their front doors unlocked, not out of naivety, but out of trust. The women on this street once passed recipes and babysat each other's children. The men built fences together and coached Little League. They knew each other's names. They knew each other's stories. It was the kind of community where you could borrow a cup of sugar and return it with a slice of cake. Clara used to sit on this porch and wave to every passerby, because every passerby was a piece of her extended family. But things changed. The change wasn't sudden. It was creeping. First came the sales flyers, slipped into mailboxes. offering cash for homes in any condition. Then came the silence. The last mercy faded. The gospel music from the Johnsons' porch grew fainter. One by one, the black families left. Some passed away. Others moved closer to grandchildren, but too many were priced out by taxes, nudged out by zoning laws, displaced by developers who didn't see history, just square footage and investment potential. Their houses were gutted, remodeled, and sold to people who didn't know or care what came before them. And those new neighbors brought different sounds, different stares. They didn't wave. They installed fences where there were none before. They joined HOA committees and talked about neighborhood standards, like the land beneath their homes didn't already belong to legacy. Clara never stopped waving, but her waves weren't returned. She kept sitting on her porch, but she became invisible, or worse, suspicious. It was a strange feeling, being made to feel foreign in a place that held your entire life. Clara had fought too hard, marched too far, and buried too many loved ones to let the new stares silence her. But silence had taken root in Meadowville, not the kind that soothed, but the kind that erased. The mailman barely looked up anymore. Packages were left at the curb instead of the porch. Cars slowed down just long enough to judge the paint on her shutters. Once, a real estate agent left a business card wedged into her mailbox without a name, just an offer. As if her home was a transaction, as if she were a relic. But Clara knew what they didn't. She knew that the foundation of her house was soaked in stories. She knew that every creak in her floorboards echoed footsteps of people who stood for something. So she stayed, and rocked, and she watched. Not because she had nothing better to do, but because she had everything to hold on to. That day, like so many others, Clara sat in her usual spot, watching the sky melt into soft oranges and bruised blues. The air was thick with the scent of her rose bushes, and a faint trace of honeysuckle drifting from somewhere up the street. Her mug rested on the table beside her, still warm with chamomile and a splash of honey. The slow creak of her rocker echoed into the quiet like a cottage. Across the street, Clara saw movement. Lindsay Parker, late 30s, rigid posture, HOA board member. Clara knew her name not because Lindsay had ever introduced herself, but because her reputation had arrived long before her smile ever did. If she had one, Clara had lived across her for nearly 5 years and still had never heard her speak to a single elder on the block, not once. Lindsay walked her miniature golden doodle the same way every day, short leash, fast steps, eyes straight ahead. But every time she passed Clara's porch, she hesitated. Her shoulders stiffened. Her grip on the leash tightened just slightly. Today, Clara noticed something more. Lindsay's phone, always in hand, was held higher than usual. Her jaw was tense, her glance quick and sharp. Clara didn't look away. She met her eyes just for a second, not with hostility, but with the weight of someone who had been seen and unseen all her life. Lindsay looked away first, as always. She quickened her pace, her sneakers thudding softly on the sidewalk. The dog yipped at something invisible. Clara rocked gently, her fingers curled around the armrest, not in fear, but in memory. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of store clerks, bus drivers, neighbors who walked their doors a little louder when she walked past. Suspicion wrapped in politeness, fear dressed in civility. Clara didn't need words to understand what Lindsay was thinking. In Meadowville, she had learned to read silence the way others read signs. As the sky dimmed and the streetlights blinked to life, Clara remained. The tension in the air was real now, humming beneath the porch wood, vibrating faintly like something was shifting, something small, something invisible, but real enough to make the birds go quiet. Clara lifted her mug again, took a slow sip, and exhaled. She didn't know exactly what Lindsay would do next, but she could feel the distance between them closing, not in understanding, but in consequence. She knew what happened when presence was mistaken for threat. She'd lived it too many times, and even now, as the wind stilled and the world darkened, Clara stayed seated, her back straight, her eyes clear. Whatever was coming, it would find her ready. Lindsay Parker stood at her kitchen window, her knuckles white against the cool granite countertop. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the freshly mowed lawn. but her eyes were locked across the street on Clara Jefferson's porch. On that still, unmoving figure, something about it unsettled her. Something about how calm she looked. How deliberate. Lindsay couldn't explain it, but her discomfort didn't ask for reason. It only needed a trigger. She'd seen Clara sitting there countless times before, yet today it felt different, more ominous, more present. The golden doodle pawed at her leg, whining for a walk, but Lindsay barely noticed. Her mind was already playing out a silent script, one full of imagined what-ifs and flickers of irrational fear. What was she doing out there for so long? Why hadn't she moved? Why was she just watching? She didn't call right away. She stood there for several minutes, heart picking up speed, fingers tapping against her phone. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was overreacting. But then again, what if she wasn't? What if something was really off? What if that woman wasn't who she appeared to be? She tried to silence the voice in her head that asked the real question, the one that began with, but she pushed it down, told herself this was about safety, about precaution, about keeping the neighborhood secure. That's what she always told herself when she reported untrimmed hedges and unfamiliar cars. And so she picked up her phone and dialed 911. The line clicked, then rang once. A calm voice answered, asking for the nature of the emergency. Lindsay's voice was firm, but her words were soaked in hesitation. "Hi, yes, I'd like to report something suspicious on Maple Street. There's a woman, elderly maybe. She's just been sitting on her porch all afternoon. I think I saw her earlier walking around. I thought I saw her looking into windows." She paused, unsure of how it sounded, how flimsy it was, but she pressed on. Just in case." The dispatcher's tone didn't shift. There were no follow-up questions, no request for details about the woman's demeanor, or if she seemed distressed. Just a quick confirmation of the address and a flat promise to send someone out. And with that, the gears began to turn. A chain reaction set in motion, not by violence, not by emergency, but by unease. Lindsay hung up and stared out the window again. Clara hadn't moved, not once, and yet everything was already starting to shift. At the county dispatch center, the call came through like dozens of others that day. Routine, unremarkable. Another checkbox on a screen. The operator didn't linger on it. There were no pressing alarms, no panicked screams, no visible danger. Just a neighbor calling about an unusual woman seen sitting on a porch. Still, the words were enough. In the system, activity had a default response. The operator typed a few lines into the dispatch report. Elderly female, possible prowling, matches description, non-compliant behavior unknown. They didn't ask for clarification on what unusual meant. They didn't ask if the woman had spoken to anyone, or if she appeared confused or ill. The caller hadn't said she looked armed or threatening. She hadn't accused her of a crime, but the implication that something about this black woman's stillness was alarm slipped through the call and embedded itself in the official language like a stain. A cruiser was assigned within 90 seconds. Deputy Troy Consinkett was driving that afternoon. He read the dispatch summary aloud as he pulled away from the precinct lot, the corner of his mouth twitching with familiar disdain. Suspicious female, possibly peeking into windows? He scoffed. Probably just some vagrant or dementia case. In the passenger seat, Deputy Jacob Miller nodded but didn't respond. He was newer to the department, still learning how much to say and when to stay quiet. His hand adjusted the body cam on his vest without thinking. He glanced at the screen, then at his partner. Consinkett had a reputation. Strict, old school, quick to escalate when authority was questioned. Some called him effective, others called him reckless. The cruiser turned onto Meadowville's side roads, the tires humming low against the pavement. They didn't flip the sirens. There was no need. This wasn't a high-threat call. This was the kind of thing they could clear in 10 minutes. A quick check, maybe a warning, maybe a report. But Consinkett was already rigid, already keyed up in that particular way that suggested this was more than a routine check for him. It was about presence, about control, about proving something. Miller tried to make small talk, to ease the tension, but the air in the cruiser stayed tight. The town slipped by outside the windows. Quiet streets, trimmed lawns, kids riding bikes toward dinner. And yet, something in the stillness felt wrong. Or maybe it was just the weight of what hadn't happened yet. Maybe it was the subtle way the temperature shifted when they turned on to Maple Street. Maybe it was how the birds had gone quiet, or how the long shadow of an old porch stretched just a little too far across the road. The house came into view, and so did the woman, sitting exactly where the report had said she would be. Still, watching, waiting. Consecate squinted. Miller shifted in his seat. The cruiser slowed. The wheels crunched softly against gravel, and the moment Clara Jefferson had felt coming all day finally arrived. Clara saw the cruiser before she heard it. It rolled slowly down Maple Street, past the white-trimmed houses and freshly planted flower beds, its glossy black and white frame cutting through the golden hour light like a warning. She didn't shift in her chair. She didn't squint. She just watched. Not because she was surprised, but because she wasn't. The stillness she had worn like armor all day had prepared her for this. She'd felt it when Lindsay passed by with that look. She'd sensed it in the way the air had gone unnaturally quiet, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. And now, here it was, the cost of being still, of being black, of being present in a place that others didn't think you belonged. She picked up her mug and took a final sip. The tea had gone cold, but she drank it anyway. With a quiet exhale, she set it gently on the small table beside her and ran one hand along the fabric of her dress, smoothing it over her knees. She adjusted her posture just slightly, sitting straighter, taller. Not out of fear, out of choice, out of dignity. Clara Jefferson had sat on this porch during joy and during grief. She had sat here when doctors gave her 6 months to live, and when her husband never came home from the hospital. She had sat here while holding back tears and while laughing so hard she nearly fell off her rocker. And now, she would sit here while they questioned her existence. The cruiser came to a stop directly in front of her house. The engine stayed on. Inside, 2 silhouettes moved. She could see their outlines through the tinted windshield. One older, stockier, already unbuckling his seatbelt with purpose. The other, younger, sat still for just a beat longer. Clara's eyes didn't leave them. She didn't flinch when the door creaked open, or when the boots hit pavement with hollow thuds. She watched them approach with the same expression she wore when pulling weeds from her garden. Focused, patient, unafraid. The cicadas buzzed louder now, like the trees themselves had taken notice. A breeze moved through the branches, but not through the porch. The officers crossed the street, their uniforms crisp, their body cams blinking red. Clara folded her hands in her lap, her fingers gently interlaced. The officer in front adjusted his belt as he reached the base of her steps. The other followed, eyes scanning everything, her face, her feet, the old flower pots, the cushion on her chair. Clara didn't move. She had seen storms like this before, and just like always, she was ready. Deputy Miller stepped forward first. His eyes flicked up toward the porch, scanning every detail. Clara's lavender dress, the chipped mug, the slant of her posture. She wasn't slouched or slumped like someone unaware. She was upright, composed, utterly still. That stillness unnerved him, not because it was threatening, but because it demanded presence. It reminded him of his grandmother, though he pushed the thought away. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, voice soft but official. "We got a call from someone concerned about activity in the neighborhood. Wanted to check if everything's all right. Can I ask what you're doing out here?" Clara's gaze didn't shift. Her voice came smooth, unwavering. "Sitting," she said, "drinking tea." Miller blinked, thrown slightly by the calm, even cadence. Before he could form his next sentence, Consencoyed stepped forward, heavy boots landing harder on the porch steps. His presence filled the space like a shadow. "Let's cut through the pleasantries," he said, glancing at Miller, then back at Clara. "You've been seen moving around earlier, peeking into windows, maybe. Someone thought it was suspicious, so now we're here, asking questions." "I haven't left this porch today," Clara replied, still seated, still calm. "Unless wind counts as movement, I'm afraid your report is mistaken." Konsinka's lips tightened. He took another step closer, looming slightly. "Ma'am, we're not here to argue. We're here to figure out what's going on. If you're not being honest, that's going to make things harder." Miller shifted beside him, his discomfort visible. His eyes darted between the older woman and his partner. Clara noticed. She noticed everything. The difference in posture, the difference in tone, the weight of assumption dripping from one, and the subtle uncertainty in the other. "I said what I said," Clara answered, folding her hands in her lap. "I've been sitting here, drinking my tea, watching my street." "Your street?" Konsinke asked, voice sharpening. "You own this street, ma'am." "I've lived on this block for 53 years, Clara said. "If history counts for anything, I've earned the right to watch it without being questioned." The words hung in the air. Miller looked down at his feet. Konsinke's jaw flexed. The dynamic was shifting, but not in their favor. Clara hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a move, and yet her presence pushed back like a wall. Concentrate took another step forward, close enough now that Clara could smell the remnants of cologne and tension on his collar. His hand dropped near his belt, not gripping his weapon, not unholstering, but close. Close enough to make a point. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said, "but you're gonna answer questions." Clara's eyes narrowed just slightly. She didn't flinch. "I already did." Deputy Konsinke's stance shifted, one boot planting firmly on the first step of Clara's porch, his fingers now fully resting on the edge of his holster. His eyes narrowed, not just assessing, but asserting. He wasn't looking for truth, he was looking for control. Behind him, Deputy Miller hesitated, clearly uneasy. His hand hovered over his radio, not yet pressing the button but close enough that Clara could see the flicker of doubt on his face. "You're refusing to answer further questions," Constantine pressed. "Because that sounds like non-compliance, ma'am. I need you to be very clear here." Clara didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her tone, but her words struck like thunder wrapped in velvet. I answered. "I haven't moved from this porch. I haven't peeked into windows. I haven't trespassed or prowled or whatever else your caller suggested. And unless sitting in my own rocking chair has become a crime, I believe we're finished." Konsinke took another step forward, the porch groaning slightly under his weight. "We need to get to the bottom of this. For all we know, you could have left earlier. Come back. And now you're lying. You sure you don't want to come downtown and clear this up?" Clara's laugh was dry, a single exhale more than sound. "No, sir, I will not be going anywhere with you." There was a long pause. The cicadas hummed louder, as if nature itself was trying to interrupt the moment. From across the street, a car door shut. A voice murmured something unintelligible. A curtain twitched. "Let me be clear with you," Clara said, eyes locked on Konsinke. "I'm not being difficult. I am being still. I am not resisting. I am simply refusing to be erased. You are here because someone got nervous about a black woman minding her business, and instead of questioning that fear, you brought it to my doorstep." Konsinke shifted, the grip on his belt tightening. His eyes flared with something dangerous. Not fear, but ego. The kind that didn't like being spoken to plainly. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Clara raised her, not shouting, but speaking clearly enough for the whole block to hear. "I will not stand. I will not leave my porch. I've done nothing wrong. You may not like that, but you will respect it." Deputy Miller swallowed hard. His gaze bounced from Clara to Konsinke, his mouth slightly open. This wasn't going the way he expected, and part of him, the part that still remembered his own grandmother's kitchen table, still remembered the smell of hot combs and the sound of gospel humming through cracked radios, knew this wasn't right. Clara noticed, and so did the neighbors. From the second-floor window across the street, Mariah Green, age 16, phone always in hand, had been watching everything. At first, she hadn't meant to record. Not unusual in this town, not anymore. But when the two officers approached Miss Clara's porch, something in her gut twisted. She knew Miss Clara, everyone did. She brought peach cobbler to church events, always asked about your mother, and remembered birthdays without needing Facebook reminders. Miss Clara didn't do anything that needed police. That's what made Mariah open her camera. Now, from her upstairs window, she watched the red light blink on her screen as she recorded. Her voice, barely audible behind the glass, whispered, "They really pressing her?" The answer was clear in every tense motion on that porch. Consakay's chest puffed, Clara's spine straighter than a flagpole. Miller, frozen halfway between action and inaction. Mariah wasn't the only one watching. Across the street, an older couple emerged from their home, cell phones already raised. Down the block, someone called out, "Everything all right over there?" But no one answered. Not yet. Clara didn't turn to look at the growing audience. She didn't need to. The air had shifted again, this time not with dread, but with weight. Witnesses changed things. Witnesses brought light, and light made it harder to lie later. Konsinka noticed too. His head turned slightly at the sound of a camera shutter. His grip twitched. He looked at Clara again, and for the first time, she saw the flicker of calculation. Not control, not dominance, just the faintest crack in the performance. She waited, let the silence stretch. Then she spoke. "You see them watching, don't you? Because they know me, and they know what this looks like." Konsinka's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. Clara continued, her voice calm, but every syllable sharpened like a blade. "I've lived here longer than your badge has existed. I've paid my taxes, taught school, buried my husband 3 blocks from where you parked your car. And today, I sat on my porch. And for that, I get your hand on a weapon?" Miller stepped back again. He didn't say it, but it was all over his face. She was right. All of it. Every word. The porch was no longer just wood and nails. It was a stage now. A battleground. A statement. The longer Clara sat, the more undeniable the truth became. She was not moving, and now the world was watching to make sure no one tried to move her. The sound came first. Low, deep, smooth. Not a roar, but a hum with purpose. A sleek black SUV rounded the corner of Maple Street, its dark frame gliding over the pavement like a shadow with a mission. It didn't speed. It didn't hesitate. It turned deliberately, passing each house with quiet precision, drawing the attention of every bystander still clutching their phones. Clara heard it before anyone else did. Her ears, long attuned to the sounds of her neighborhood, registered the weight of the tires, the whir of the engine, the pause at the stop sign. She didn't move, didn't blink, but she felt her heart answer that sound the way it always did. That sound meant her son was near. The SUV came to a silent stop just past the patrol car. The engine cut, and for a moment the only sound on the block was the soft rustle of the trees. Then the door opened. Elijah Jefferson stepped out, and the street changed. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. But the moment his polished black shoes touched the ground, the atmosphere thickened. He stood tall, over 6 feet, wearing a pressed Navy mule Homeland Security uniform that hugged his broad shoulders and bore the unmistakable weight of rank. His presence didn't demand attention, it commanded it. Every movement was precise, controlled. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in the 2 deputies, the neighbors, and then they landed on her. "Mom," he said, quietly but clearly. Clara's lips didn't move, but her eyes softened for the first time all day. She gave a single nod, nothing more. Deputy Konsinkade instinctively stepped back. He didn't recognize the man, not yet, but he recognized the energy shift. Miller straightened, already regretting not doing so earlier. The younger deputy opened his mouth, but no words came. Elijah walked toward the porch with even strides, his eyes never leaving the 2 men standing between him and his mother. He didn't speak until he reached the bottom step. Then his voice cut through the tension like a blade made of velvet. "Arthur," he said, "would one of you like to tell me why you're standing on my mother's porch, with your hand near a weapon?" Neither deputy responded right away. Konsinkai's mouth parted slightly. Miller looked down again. Elijah waited. His hands remained at his sides, but his stance was unmistakable. He wasn't here to plead. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to understand and to hold someone accountable. "Badge numbers," Elijah said, more firmly this time. "Now?" Deputy Miller fumbled first. His voice cracked slightly as he stammered, Deputy Jacob Miller, badge number 0821. He cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the porch railing. He still couldn't bring himself to look Elijah in the eye. Konsinka hesitated, jaw clenched, fingers twitching on his utility belt. But something in Elijah's presence, unshaken, quiet, commanding, made defiance feel dangerous. Finally, he muttered, "Deputy Troy Konsinka, badge number 01679. Elijah nodded once. "Thank you." He took another step up the porch stairs, not hurried, not hostile, just closer. Clara watched him, still seated, still dignified. Her hands were folded now, resting gently in her lap. She didn't need to say anything. She had already said enough. This was now Elijah's moment, and she trusted him with it. He turned back toward the officers, slowly pulling a slim black wallet from his back pocket. With one hand, he opened it and held it up. The Homeland Security emblem glinted in the evening light. "My name is Commander Elijah Jefferson," he said. "Homeland Security, federal clearance. And the woman you just questioned, the woman you threatened with your hand on your weapon, is my mother." The words hit like a thunderclap. Konsinka took half a step back. Miller visibly flinched. A ripple moved through the small crowd now gathering across the street. A woman gasped, phones tilted upward, capturing the moment with more urgency than before. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Everything about him said authority. Everything about him said, "You messed with the wrong woman." "I want to be absolutely clear," he said, his tone razor sharp. "My mother has lived in this house longer than I've been alive. She survived cancer in that chair. She helped organize the voter registration drives in the 60s, from that porch. She buried my father and still found the strength to sit there every day as this neighborhood changed around her." He paused, letting each sentence settle like bricks on the deputy's shoulders. "Sat still, on her own porch, drinking tea, and you escalated it. You stepped onto her porch, questioned her, without probable cause, and let your biases turn a call of concern into a near confrontation." Konsinka's face reddened. Miller was pale. Elijah's voice dropped lower now, not out of weakness, but precision. "I have enough rank to file a formal report that ends careers, but that's not what I'm here to do. I'm here because a line was crossed, and it's not just about protocol, it's about respect, dignity, and history." He turned and looked directly at Konsinka. "And you just disrespected all three." Konsinka opened his mouth, searching for a defense, but nothing came, not a single word that could justify what had just happened. Not to Elijah, and certainly not to Clara. His voice, so sharp and commanding minutes earlier, was now caught in the back of his throat, tangled in the realization that every second of this, not just by body cams, but by a son who carried more power in his presence than Konsinka had ever felt in uniform. Elijah took another step forward. Now they were eye to eye. Konsinka straightened instinctively, as if rank alone might shield him, but Elijah didn't blink. "No weapon," Elijah said quietly. "No threat, no crime, and yet here we are, two armed officers pressing a 76-year-old woman for sitting on her porch in a neighborhood she helped build. Tell me what part of that feels like protect and serve to you." Miller shifted awkwardly, guilt bleeding across his features. He didn't try to speak. He didn't try to run from it. He just stood there, marinating in the truth of it all. Elijah noticed, but he wasn't ready to let go. "Do you understand the danger you put her in?" he asked, his voice steady. "You stepped onto her property, with power, with weapons, and with bias. You didn't stop to ask why. Your instinct was to treat a seated elder as a suspect. You didn't pause to think about the optics. You moved forward because you could, Because you've done it before." The crowd across the street had grown. At least a dozen now. Cameras were no longer held discreetly. They were aimed directly. Voices whispered Clara's name. A few people murmured prayers. One man began streaming live. Elijah turned slightly, gesturing subtly to the audience, without ever breaking his focus. "This moment you created, it's not just going to disappear. This is what happens when power is unaccountable, when history gets ignored, when authority goes unchecked." He looked back at Conseneg, his final words landing like a slow, crushing verdict. "My mother isn't a suspect, she's a survivor, and you don't get to write her into a crime just because you don't understand her presence." Nsika's face was blank now, eyes darting toward the patrol car. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the stiffening posture of a man who realized the ground beneath him had shifted and he had nothing left to stand on. Elijah turned his back on them without another word. He walked up the porch steps, knelt beside Clara, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked at him, eyes full, not with fear, not even with relief, but with pride. He leaned in and whispered, just for her, "I am here now." She nodded, once, just once, and sat a little straighter. The deputies stood frozen, the cameras kept rolling, and for the first time that day it was clear. The balance of power had changed, not with force, not with noise, but with truth. Clara didn't speak for a moment after Elijah placed his hand on her shoulder. The silence between them was heavy, not with fear, but with the ache of something too old and too familiar. She looked out at the street, at the deputies who had come to challenge her stillness, and then at the neighbors who had gathered to protect it. Slowly she nodded to Elijah. Then, her voice steady, measured, cut through the humid Georgia air. "He told me to choose," she said, eyes never leaving the horizon. "Come quietly or be arrested." Elijah's jaw tightened. The words hit like embers on dry grass, slow to burn at first, but deadly once ignited. His breath caught in his throat for a moment, before he stood again, eyes narrowing on Cinca's head. "You said that to her?" he asked, voice controlled, but sharp enough to slice through concrete. Cinca shifted his weight. "That's not exactly what I—" "She is 76 years old," Elijah said, voice driving just slightly. "She's drinking tea on her porch, and you gave her a threat disguised as a choice?" Cinca opened his mouth, then closed it again. Miller stood behind him now, his eyes on the ground, the shame practically radiating off his skin. "She was calm, she was cooperative, and you treated her like a trespasser in her own home." Clara stood now, slowly, but fully upright, her chin lifted as if the weight of the moment had been passed to her deliberately. "Even if I hadn't been cooperative," she said, her voice calm, "that still wouldn't have justified a hand on your holster." The crowd murmured. Phones zoomed in. Elijah looked out at the gathering and saw what he had hoped for. The community wasn't just witnessing. They were remembering. They were documenting. One woman called out, "We got all of it on video." Another added, "She's our elder. You don't treat her like that." And then more doors opened. More neighbors stepped out onto porches. One man came forward, arms folded, recording silently. Children peeked from behind legs. No one was yelling, but the energy had changed. Clara wasn't alone anymore. Neither was Elijah. The street had turned into a stage of reckoning. Elijah turned back to the officers. "You've made a mess here," he said, "but it won't be swept under a rug. You're going to explain yourselves. Every detail, every interaction, every second of that body cam footage. Because you didn't just embarrass yourselves, you embarrassed this badge, and you insulted this community." He took a deep breath. "Now I want names. I want the watch commander's contact. I want a full report filed, and I wanted it filed with my name on the record." Cinca looked like he might resist, but this time he didn't speak. Elijah stepped closer. "Because right now, you're not just dealing with a son, You're dealing with someone who still believes in justice, and you're going to answer for what you did to my mother." Konsinka looked like a man caught between instinct and consequence. His mouth tightened into a bitter line, as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't find a single word that wouldn't damn him further. His eyes flicked to Miller, then to the cluster of neighbors watching, then back to Elijah, whose every movement pulsed with clarity and command. Elijah didn't blink. "You gave my mother an ultimatum," he said, his voice deep, deliberate. "You threatened to arrest a woman with no weapon, no crime, no complaint, because she wouldn't stand on your command, because she dared to sit where she's always sat, because a phone call from a fearful neighbor mattered more to you than her dignity." Konsinka started. "We had to respond to—" "Elia?" snapped Weicker. "A black woman existing in daylight?" The crowd murmured louder now. It wasn't just anger, it was memory. It was recognition. What happened to Clara had happened before. Maybe not with federal agents, or cameras, or witnesses, but it had happened, and this time, it wouldn't be quiet. "You've got a choice now," Elijah continued, walking slowly toward the deputies. "You can cooperate fully and file the suspension reports yourselves, or I can call your watch commander, your sheriff, and the DOJ's Civil Rights Division from my phone right now. This isn't going away." Miller spoke up, voice shaky. I'll pull the body cam footage and log the interaction myself. I didn't mean for it to go this way." Clara watched him, her face unreadable. "And you?" Elijah turned to Consacade. "You going to try and explain to your department why you escalated a peaceful scene into a public humiliation? Or are you going to do what little's left of the right thing?" Konsinka's lips parted again, but he saw the phones. The porch, the stillness of the woman he had tried to unseat with intimidation. He nodded, once, stiffly. Elijah nodded too. "Then here's what happens next. You're going to leave this property. You're not going to say another word to my mother, and you're going to do it quietly." The street froze. The wind caught the edge of the American flag on the neighbor's pole. A dog barked in the distance, but no one turned. Konsinka stepped off the porch without another word. He walked down the steps slowly, as if each one carried the weight of his badge. Miller followed, his head down, hands twitching at his sides. They crossed the street, passing neighbors whose eyes didn't blink, whose phones didn't lower. They reached the cruiser. Miller opened the door. Constabule paused, hand on the roof of the car, then turned to look back. He didn't say it, but everything in his expression asked the question, how did I lose control so quickly? He found no answer, only Clara, still standing, still watching. The car door shut. The cruiser pulled away, slower than when it had arrived. Back on the porch, Elijah exhaled hard. The tightness in his chest released, but only slightly. Clara reached for his hand, gently this time. "You did right," she said. He looked at her, swallowing the anger still sitting behind his ribs. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Clara shook her head. "I'm sorry you had to see it." He bowed his head, forehead almost touching hers. And for a moment, everything stilled again, not with tension, but with something deeper. A quiet reclaiming. Elijah sat beside his mother now, their shoulders almost touching on the creaking wooden swing. The crowd had thinned slightly, but the energy lingered, charged, reverent, unresolved. A few neighbors remained across the street, still filming, still witnessing. But for now, the porch had returned to something resembling sacred ground. Clara sipped from the same chipped mug she had held when it all began. It was lukewarm, half-empty, but she drank it as if it were a ritual, a reminder that she was still here. She looked over at her son, the lines around her son. "You've always been good with your words," she said, voice quiet, but firm. "Even when you were little, you knew how to stop a room just by walking in." Elijah chuckled, the sound brittle. "Didn't think I'd have to use it like this." Clara nodded slowly. "I never wanted you to have to." He looked at her, the muscle in his jaw twitching again. "I've dealt with terrorists, foreign dignitaries, governors, but nothing ever prepares you for watching someone you love get treated like they don't matter." Clara's gaze turned distant, her voice almost a whisper. "That's the part that hurts the most. Not the treatment, not the words. It's the fact that we've learned how to carry it like normal." They sat in silence for a moment. The swing moved gently. The sun had begun to dip, casting long orange shadows across the porch. Elijah glanced over at her again. "They'll feel this," he said. "Not just here. This video. It's going to move." Clara didn't smile, but there was something in her eyes, something unshaken. "I don't need revenge," she said. "I just need them to understand we were always watching, always remembering, and now the world gets to remember with us." Elijah nodded, then reached over and placed his hand over hers. The porch was quiet again, but this time it wasn't eerie. It was full of presence, of power reclaimed, of history refusing to be erased. Elijah didn't sleep that night. The porch lights flickered off eventually. The neighbors went inside. Clara went to bed, slow but firm in her steps, the same steps she had taken for over 5 decades in that house. But Elijah stayed up, first on the porch, then in the living room, then finally at the kitchen table, with his phone, a legal pad, and the kind of fury only a son protecting his mother could channel into something focused. He made his first call before midnight to the Internal Affairs Division of the Meadowville Sheriff's Department. He didn't ask, he reported the incident, the officers, the body cam footage, the witness accounts, the chain of command violations. His voice was calm, but it carried a force beneath the words, a kind of threat dressed in protocol. When they asked for documentation, he said, "You'll have it before dawn." Then he called the office of the Inspector General for the state, loud a secondary complaint, marked it as urgent. Then the Civil Rights Division, federal level. Then legal. By 2 a.m., he had spoken with 4 different attorneys and 3 advocacy groups, including one that specialized in racial profiling lawsuits. He didn't need to convince them. The moment he said, "body cam footage," 2 deputies, "my mother, no cause," they responded the same way, "Send us the file." By 3 a.m., Elijah had filed a formal request for suspension hearings. By 4:15 a.m., the first local journalist emailed him asking for a quote. At 4:27 alive, Elijah replied with a statement. 2 deputies approached my mother's porch with aggression, bias, and no cause. I was there. I witnessed it, and the world deserves to see it too. He attached a 42-second edited clip from the body cam footage, just enough to show Conson K's hand on his holster, just enough to show Clara sitting still, just enough to hear Elijah say, "That's my mother." At 5:02 a.m., the clip went live. Within 10 minutes, it was on 3 platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. By 5:23, the views had crossed 10,000. Elijah didn't feel triumph. He felt the beginning of the reckoning. And then, at 6:08 a.m., his phone rang. It was the sheriff. The sheriff's voice came through the line, tight, anxious, and far too rehearsed. Elijah answered on the second ring, already knowing what was coming. "Elijah," the sheriff said, as if they were old friends. They weren't. "Look, I just saw the video. I wanted to reach out directly before this gets out of hand." "It's already out of hand," Elijah replied. "And you're late." There was a pause, a long one. Then the sheriff tried again. "I understand emotions are high." "Stop." Elijah's tone was ice. "Don't say this is about emotion. This is about misconduct. Don't call it a misunderstanding. Don't soften it for the press." The sheriff sighed. "What exactly do you want from me right now?" "I want both deputies suspended. Today. I want body cam footage released without delay. I want your department to take accountability. Publicly, and I want you to say my mother's name in that apology." Another silence. Then, "You're putting me in a difficult spot." Elijah didn't blink. No, they did. When they threatened my mother, when they stood on her porch like it wasn't sacred ground, I'm giving you a chance to stand up before this becomes national. "Let me talk to the union rep," the sheriff said. "You do that," Elijah replied, "but know this. I've already spoken to the Civil Rights Division. This isn't staying local." He ended the call. By then, the footage had crossed 100,000 views. News alerts began pinging his inbox. The headlines wrote themselves. "Commander confronts racist deputies who threatened his mother." "Black elder nearly arrested on her porch. Son reveals he's federal agent." Body cam footage shows power, prejudice, and a mother's stillness. Able outlets requested interviews. Elijah declined. For now, he wasn't interested in sound bites. He was building something longer, deeper. But the video, it kept spreading. Civil rights groups reposted it. Celebrities retweeted it. Activists added it to threads about racial profiling and elder abuse. And in Meadowville, things were no longer quiet. By noon, small groups gathered in front of the sheriff's office. Some held signs, some held phones, some held each other. One sign read, "Stillness isn't a crime." Another, "Say her name, Clara Jefferson." Elijah watched from the porch as the world around his mother began to turn. Clara remained inside, sipping coffee at the kitchen window, her eyes not surprised. "You all right, Ma?" he asked as he walked in. She looked at him, face unreadable. "They've been rewriting it since before you were born," she said, "calling it misunderstanding, calling it standard procedure. This ain't new. What's new is that someone finally stayed long enough to show the world what it really is." Elijah nodded. She looked at him, Clara added, "I want to see what they do when the cameras don't blink." He stood there for a moment, struck by her calm, not passive, not broken, just deeply, profoundly knowing. And in that knowing, he understood why this moment mattered so much. It wasn't the views or the headlines. It was the reckoning of truth stepping into the daylight and refusing to be pushed back into the shadows again. By late afternoon, the sheriff held a press conference outside the department building. A small crowd had gathered: activists, local news crews, curious residents who had seen the video on their phones and followed the ripple to its source. The podium was flanked by 2 deputy flags, one county, one staff. The sheriff stepped up, flanked not by staff, but alone. He cleared his throat and looked out at the lenses. Sweat dotted his collar, even in the shade. "Of 3:00 p.m. today," he began, "Deputy Troy Consonet and Deputy Jacob Miller have been placed on administrative suspension pending an internal investigation into the incident that occurred outside the residence of Ms. Clara Jefferson." He paused. "We acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. The video circulating online reveals a deeply troubling interaction that does not reflect the standards or expectations of this department. We have launched a full inquiry and will be reviewing all protocols, including community policing and interactions with our elders." A reporter raised her hand. "Will the deputies be fired?" The sheriff hesitated. "That will depend on the findings of the investigation, which will be conducted with transparency." Another voice. "Will the department issue a formal apology?" The sheriff looked down at his notes, then back up at the crowd. "On behalf of this department, I extend a formal apology to Miss Clara Jefferson and her family for the distress caused. No citizen, especially not a respected elder, should feel unsafe on their own porch. We are committed to doing better." Elijah watched it all unfold from his phone, the screen casting a faint glow across his mother's living room. He turned the volume down and stepped outside, joining Clara on the porch, where the whole thing had begun. She didn't speak right away. She just rocked gently in her chair, the creak of old wood now a kind of anthem. Elijah pulled up a chair beside her. "You heard it?" he asked. She nodded. "They apologized. They suspended both of them." She nodded again. "Then, after a pause, they suspended them. But you know they only did it because they got caught." Elijah didn't argue. He knew she was right. "It's not justice," she continued. "It's containment. It's damage control. Same thing they've been doing since they started wearing uniforms." He glanced at her. "You're not satisfied?" "I'm never satisfied when respect has to be demanded instead of given," she said. "But I'm used to it. Doesn't mean I'll stop sitting here. Doesn't mean they get to take my stillness and call it suspicious." He sat back, folding his arms. "You don't want to press charges?" She shook her head. "I want them to remember what it felt like to be the ones looked at sideways for once. Let them carry that weight a while. See how heavy it gets." The sun had dipped low again, casting gold across the porch rails. Voices still lingered down the block. A few cars passed slower than usual. Someone honked. 2 quick beeps, a gesture of support. Clara closed her eyes and inhaled deep. "I was here before them," she said, "and I'll be here long after." And in that moment, the porch was quiet again, but not defeated. It was enduring. The old Baptist church on the corner of Jefferson and 3rd hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. The pews filled quickly, folding chairs added in rows that reached the back walls. The smell of pine wood and floor polish floated under the hum of murmured voices. The lights overhead buzzed, but no one noticed. All eyes were forward on the pulpit, on the empty microphone standing tall, and on the man seated just behind it. Elijah Jefferson sat beside the pastor, suit crisp, shoulders squared, but eyes tied. He scanned the room, young faces, old faces, some familiar, some not. Most were black. A few white residents sat scattered, uncertain. One row near the front held 3 uniformed officers from a neighboring district. They watched quietly, hands holded. And near the middle, sitting silently in a sea of tense shoulders, was Clara. She wore the same simple cardigan she'd had on that day. No fanfare, no dramatics, just presence. And her presence was enough to hush the whispers. The pastor cleared his throat. "Tonight, we gather not just to speak, but to reckon, with truth, with each other, with what we allow and what we demand." Then he stepped aside and nodded to Elijah. Elijah rose slowly, his steps deliberate. He didn't speak right away when he reached the mic. He looked down first, then raised his head. "Name is Elijah Jefferson. I'm a federal officer, but tonight I'm here as a son." A murmur rolled through the church. "Most of you know what happened," he continued. "You've seen the footage. You've seen the silence that followed and the noise that came after. What you haven't seen is the years that led up to it, years of quiet compliance, of being told to trust the system while the system never trusted us." A soft meh came from the back row. "This isn't just about one incident," he said. "It's about the daily indignities, the silent assumptions, the way fear gets weaponized and respect gets rationed." He stepped back. "This mic isn't just mine, it's yours." The pastor nodded, and the first hand went up. A woman in her 70s stood, slowly, walking to the mic, with the rhythm of someone used to carrying more than her share. "My name's Evelyn Marks," she said. "I've lived here since '63, and I've been stopped 5 times on my own block. Last time was just 2 months ago. Told them my name. They asked me if I was related to any known offenders. I said, only crime I've committed is surviving this long." Laughter, low, knowing, spread across the room. She continued, "But I never reported it. Figured nothing would change." She stepped back. A man came next. Then a teenager. Then a teacher. One by one, the stories came. Some short, some choked with tears, some shouted in anger. And still, Clara sat, silent, unmoved, but undeniable. The next voice came unexpectedly, from the far left pew, where a woman had sat motionless the entire evening, hands folded tightly in her lap. Lindsay Parker stood. She was dressed simply. No pearls, no designer scarf, none of the trappings that usually adorned her at homeowners association meetings. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and as she walked toward the mic, her pace was slow, unsure. A few people whispered. One woman near the front folded her arms tight across her chest. No one applauded, no one encouraged. But no one stopped her either. When Lindsay reached the microphone, she gripped both sides of the wooden stand, as if it might anchor her. She looked out not just at Clara, not just at Elijah, but at everyone. "My name is Lindsay Parker," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I live 2 houses down from Ms. Jefferson, and I'm the one who made the call." A heavy silence fell, the kind that doesn't just fill a room, it sits on the chest. I said she was behaving unusually, that she might be peeking into windows, that something didn't feel right, Lindsay continued. But what I really meant was, I was uncomfortable. I saw someone who didn't look like me, and I assumed something was wrong. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard. I didn't see a neighbor. I didn't see history. I didn't see a woman simply sitting on her porch drinking tea. I saw a threat. She paused, searching for words. I thought I was being cautious. I told myself I was just looking out for the neighborhood. But what I did, it wasn't protection, it was profiling. Someone in the back muttered, "Say that." Lindsay nodded, hearing it. "It was profiling," she repeated, "and it was wrong." She glanced toward Clara, who hadn't moved. "I watched the video like everyone else. I saw how calm you were, how still, and I realized I was the one who escalated. Not with a phone, with my fear." The pastor stepped slightly closer, as if to prepare for intervention, but Lindsay held steady. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "and I'm not here to fix what I broke. I needed to name it, publicly, because that's the least I can do." She stepped back, breathing deeply as if surfacing from underwater. She returned to her seat without applause, without acknowledgement, only the silence of a room forced to face an uncomfortable mirror. Clara remained still. And then, slowly, deliberately, she rose. Clara stood slowly, her hands resting briefly on the edge of the pew, before she straightened her back. Every eye followed her as she moved down the aisle, not with urgency, but with weight. Her steps didn't seek attention, but they demanded it all the same. When she reached the microphone, she didn't lean into it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room had already gone completely still. Her voice came soft, but it carried. "I marched in Selma," she began. "I watched dogs turned on children. I watched men in uniforms knock my husband to the ground because he didn't cross the street fast enough. I've buried friends who didn't live long enough to see a day like this. And even now, in this body, in this skin, I'm still seen as suspicious." A murmur rolled through the pews, but she kept going. "Let me be clear. Fear isn't a reason, and comfort isn't an excuse." She looked toward Lindsay, whose shoulders tightened visibly. "I've seen fear weaponized my whole life, people calling it concern, calling it safety. But I know what it really is. It's a story folks tell themselves so they can sleep at night, so they don't have to ask who taught them what danger looks like." She took a breath. "When I sat on my porch, I wasn't thinking about race. I wasn't thinking about making a statement. I was thinking about my knees, and the heat, and whether my tea needed more lemon, but someone else was thinking about danger, about suspicion, about calling." She paused, letting the silence hold steady. "And the truth is, That call could have ended my life, like it ended so many others before me. There were sniffles now. Eyes glistened. Some heads bowed. Clara looked out across the crowd, face calm but unshaken. "But I'm still here," she said, "and since I am, I'll use this breath to say something I never thought I'd say to the person who made that call." She turned again to Lindsay. "I forgive you." Gasps fluttered across the sanctuary. "But I remember," Clara added. And those three words, quiet, firm, final, landed like thunder. "I remember what fear costs people who look like me. I remember how easily our humanity gets overridden by someone else's assumptions. I remember what it feels like to be questioned on ground I paid for, with money I earned, in a house I built with my late husband." She scanned the room now, voice stronger. Said Miss Annoyer, "But I forgive because it's easy. I forgive because I refuse to carry your fear on my back any longer." The room was silent, breathless. "I forgive," she repeated, "but I remember." She stepped back, and for a moment the sanctuary was completely frozen. Then the pastor approached her, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder. Then, one by one, people stood, not with applause, but with reverence. A slow rising, a collective breath. Clara returned to her seat. Elijah reached for her hand and squeezed it, hard. And as the town finally exhaled, something in the room shifted. Not closure, not yet, but the beginning of healing. The Internal Affairs Unit wasn't built for storms. Most of their investigations ended in silence, disciplinary memos, desk reassignments, maybe a quiet retirement, but this wasn't one of those cases. This one had footage. This one had names. This one had Clara Jefferson. It began with the request for full data access, submitted by Elijah 3 days after the town hall. He didn't just want body cam reviews. He wanted complaint logs, arrest demographics, dispatch call logs, and internal memos. He wanted every paper trail that had ever justified suspicion in Meadowville. At first, there was resistance. "We don't keep some of those in digital form," one admin said. Elijah responded with a quiet, "Then start scanning." Once the files were in hand, patterns emerged fast, and they were damning. Of the 213 calls classified as suspicious person reports over the past 2 years, 174 involved Black residents. Of those, 62% were elderly. More than half had no official report filed afterward. No crime, no citation, just suspicion, logged and forgotten. Then came the field stop data. Deputy Consa Kayed had the highest number of stops involving elderly Black residents, and the lowest rate of citation or arrest. In 84 documented cases, he never once filed a charge. ASBAC logs revealed another crack. Caller language mattered. Reports that used phrases like aggressive, unusual behavior, or didn't belong triggered higher priority response codes, especially when the subject was described vaguely and was Black. Clara's incident wasn't a fluke. It was procedure. The final blow came from a string of whistleblowers, right or honor opposite consensus, who had stayed silent for years. One email, sent anonymously, read, "Everyone knows Consinka's targets. We just didn't want to be next." Elijah compiled everything into a report, 132 pages. Charts, graphs, first-handed accounts, comparison data from similar counties. He didn't submit it quietly. He sent it to state oversight, to the Justice Department, to 5 major newspapers. He included a foreword. "This began with a grandmother, but it will not end with her." Elijah didn't wait for permission. The morning after submitting his report, he appeared live on a local news station. Calm, prepared, devastating. "The data shows a clear pattern," he told the anchor. "This isn't about one deputy. It's about a system that trains people to see black skin as probable cause and then rewards them for acting on it. The clip went viral, not just regionally, nationally. It hit the front page of the state paper, then the Metro News in Atlanta. Then a civil rights podcast picked it up and played the clip cold. Within 48 hours, Elijah had 3 interview requests from national media, including one with a primetime anchor who had covered Ferguson, Baltimore, and Minneapolis. He said yes. And each time, his message sharpened. Mother's porch became a crime scene because of bias, he said. But the bigger crime is how many porches, how many people, how many lives have been quietly crushed under policies just like this. The public was listening. But inside the Meadowville Police Department, the sound of that message was thunder, and it split the ranks in half. Some officers supported him, quietly slipping messages into his inbox. "Keep going. We've needed this for a long time. You're speaking truth most of us are too afraid to say." But others weren't so quiet. Anonymous online forums lit up with resentment. Posts titled, "Traitor in Blue," spread on law enforcement message boards. Concerned supporters painted Elijah as a political opportunist, someone using his mother's pain for media glory. One officer was overheard saying, "I used to respect Jefferson. Now he's just another activist with a badge." Tensions flared inside roll calls. One sergeant refused to show the body cam training video Elijah had recommended. Another threatened to request reassignment if Elijah stepped foot in the department again. Still, Elijah kept pushing. He partnered with a civil rights oversight group, giving them full access to the data, the footage, the whistleblower emails. They announced an independent investigation, one with subpoena power and national reach. He also drafted a new policy proposal. It called for mandatory review of all suspicious person calls within 24 hours, radio neo-nautical dispatch coding language, pressure de-escalation certification renewals every 6 months, independent community board to review body cam footage. He emailed the policy draft to every member of the county commission. Then he showed up at the next public meeting to present it in person. "I'm not here to negotiate," he told them. "I'm here to remind you that silence has a body count, and this town is out of time." Outside the meeting hall, cameras waited. Inside, a line of young activists sat with shirts reading, "Porch is not a crime scene." It was no longer just about Clara. It was about every porch like hers, every still moment mistaken for threat, every grandmother like Clara, whose dignity was interrupted by a knock, a question, a hand near a holster. And in the storm of all that exposure, all that momentum, Elijah felt it creeping in again. That cold, quiet loneliness. That echo of being the only one speaking in a room full of people too afraid to say it with him. Elijah didn't speak much that night. After the council meeting, after the flashbulbs and interviews and firm handshakes from lawyers, he drove straight home. Not to his condo in the city, but back to Meadowville, back to the street with the cracked sidewalk, back to the porch where this all began. Clara was already out there. The sun had dipped just enough to tint the sky peach. She rocked slowly, as always, a light shawl draped across her shoulders. The porch light wasn't on yet, but it didn't need to be. Elijah sat beside her, loosening his tie. For a moment, they didn't say anything. Then he spoke, not with fire, not with the righteous cadence he'd used in interviews or on stage, just quiet, just tired. "I feel alone in this." Clara didn't look at him, but he felt her presence shift, like her focus turned inward and outward at the same time. "I've got people behind me, I know that, but it still feels like I'm the only one carrying the full weight, like I'm holding up a mirror and everyone's flinching away." The cicadas buzz, low and steady. "I get called a hero in the papers, but the folks I used to call brothers act like I betrayed them," The ones who whisper support never speak it out loud. And I don't know how long I can hold this line by myself. She turned her head then, looked him right in the face. Then lead, she said. Lead until you're not. He blinked. She didn't blink back. You think I marched with hundreds back in the day? She asked. No. Sometimes it was just 10 of us. Sometimes 2. Sometimes just me and your daddy standing in front of a courthouse with a sign that said, I am a man, and every car that passed by spit words we had to swallow just to stand tall. She pointed a slow finger outward toward the street. You see this? This porch? It used to be just wood and nails, but now it's something more. Because of you. Because you stayed. Because you didn't flinch. He looked down at the floorboards beneath his feet. Suddenly, they didn't feel old. They felt heavy, sacred. You're not alone, she said. You're just early. And that was when the headlights hit the driveway. A news van, then another. Elijah stood instinctively, but Clara stayed seated. By the time the reporters reached the gate, their cameras already rolling, Clara looked like royalty. A woman in her chair, in her power, in her place. One journalist whispered, "There she is." Another murmured, "It's her porch." And that was how the headline read the next morning. Porch that changed everything. CNN replayed the footage from the town hall. MSNBC ran a segment titled, "Stillness as Resistance." A scholar called it a Rosa Parks moment in modern suburbia. And Clara Jefferson? She poured herself a cup of tea, adjusted the cushion on her seat, and waited for the world to catch up. It began with a voicemail. A woman's voice, cracked, elderly, barely above a whisper. Name is Geneva Adams. I'm 82. Last summer I got stopped in front of the post office for walking too slow. I had my ID on a lanyard around my neck. I kept pointing to it. They told me to sit on the curb while they checked if I was real. I wasn't even holding a bag, just my cane. The message ended there. But it opened the floodgates. Next came a teenage boy, barely 17, who had been frisked while walking home from basketball practice. His crime? A hoodie. His defense? I didn't talk back. Then, a middle-aged nurse who'd been locked out of her own car in the hospital parking lot and asked to prove she worked there 3 times before a white security officer finally let her through. None of these made headlines before. But now the town was listening. Meadowville had opened its wounds. Not because it wanted to, because it had to. The local paper ran a column titled, "After Clara," and it became the most read piece in its 10-year history. The comments section overflowed. Some posts were defensive, some were remorseful, most were just stunned. One anonymous commenter wrote, "I thought this was a safe town. Turns out it was only safe for some." Community meetings swelled. Church basements, library conference rooms, city council halls. People came not just to hear, but to speak, to reckon, to name what had never been named before. One woman, holding a faded photograph of her father in his Navy uniform, stood up and said, "He came back from war and still had to cross the street when a white woman walked by. That was 70 years ago, and my grandson just told me he does the same thing today, just in case." The silence that followed was suffocating, but necessary. Because Meadowville was no longer pretending it didn't know. The stories kept coming, each one less shocking than the last. Not because they were less painful, but because they were too familiar. And through it all, Clara sat on her porch, the center of the storm, unmoved, not invisible, but choosing silence where others now spoke. Because the town had finally found its voice. The morning after Clara's porch became a national landmark, 3 production vans pulled up to her curb. They came from opposite coasts, New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, each with teams of producers, sound technicians, and stylists ready to turn a 76-year-old woman into the centerpiece of America's latest reckoning. They came with questions, with segment titles, with pre-written introductions that described her as brave, unbreakable, the mother who shook a system. But when Clara opened her screen door and stepped onto the porch, she didn't smile for the cameras. She simply said, no. No to the interviews. No to the specials. No to the documentary offerers, the book agents, the magazine shoots asking her to pose near the same rocking chair where she was once nearly arrested. This isn't about being seen, she told them. It's about being safe. They didn't know how to respond. They'd never seen someone say no to legacy on live television. But Clara didn't need legacy. She already had one. And it wasn't built for ratings. It was built in the heat of marches, the stillness of prayer circles, the silence after her husband's funeral, the sound of her grandson's voice when he said, "I'll make it right." She'd already done her part. Now it was time for others to do theirs. At the county administration building, the sheriff stood at a podium, flanked by 2 city commissioners and the county legal counsel. His face was tired, but his voice was steady. "This is a turning point," he began, "and turning points require more than statements. They require structure." He lifted a blue folder and opened it. In response to the Jefferson incident and the investigation that followed, the Meadowville Sheriff's Department is enacting a 3-part reform initiative. He held up one finger. All officers will undergo mandatory quarterly anti-bias training, developed in partnership with independent civil rights educators. Completion is required for field duty. A second finger. 2. We are establishing a civilian oversight board comprised of local residents, clergy members, educators, and retired legal professionals. They will review all complaints related to field conduct and community interaction. And a third. 3. The department will adopt a new de-escalation certification standard. Officers must demonstrate live scenario proficiency every 6 months. Failure to meet the standard will result in suspension. Reporters' hands shot up. Questions followed. Now? What took so long? Will misconduct be retroactively reviewed? The sheriff answered as best he could, but the real answer was already known. It took Clara. It took exposure. It took shame. The plan wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the damage done. But it drew a line, and from that day forward, every officer in Meadowville would have to choose, stand on the old side or step across. In the crowd, Elijah watched from the back. He didn't smile. He didn't clap. He just nodded, once. It wasn't victory, but it was movement. And that was enough, for now. The offer came on official letterhead, sealed and hand-delivered. It was a pathway, a clear one. In 3 years, Elijah would be chief of the entire state's Public Integrity Division, if he accepted a strategic reassignment now. It was structured, groomed, planned. The kind of opportunity few black men in law enforcement were ever given, especially those who didn't play quiet. But Elijah didn't feel triumphant. He felt torn. He placed the letter face down on the table and stared at the wall of his apartment. It had nothing on it. No awards, no plaques, no newspaper clippings from the interviews he'd done over the past few weeks. Just the empty silence of decisions too large for their envelope. He knew what the job meant: influence, policy access, leverage. He also knew what it demanded: silence on certain things, avoidance of others, and a full stop on the fire he'd just started in Meadowville. They didn't say it out loud, but it was in the tone of the letter. Accept this, and your platform grows. Speak out again, and the offer disappears. That night he drove, Not to the Capitol, not to his supervisor, but to the porch. Clara was there, of course. The dusk was settling in, sky streaked with deep orange and soft gray. She had her usual tea. She didn't ask what brought him. She just moved a cushion beside her and said, "Sit." He sat. For a while, there was only the sound of cicadas and the creak of wood. Then Elijah spoke. He offered me a tract to Chief. 3 years. Clara raised an eyebrow. Fast. Very. She waited. They want me to accept a different post. Less visibility, less conflict, more diplomacy. He didn't look at her when he added, "It feels like a reward, but also like a leash." She nodded slowly, eyes on the horizon. "You ever feel like you're betraying something just by moving up?" Clara turned to him. "Baby, progress always makes somebody uncomfortable, sometimes even the one making it." He sighed. "They say I can change more from the inside." Clara's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. "Maybe, or maybe they just want you quiet enough to forget." He nodded, slowly, quietly. Then she added, "But maybe your job isn't to change everything." He looked up at her, eyes sharp. "Maybe," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's to make it impossible to stay the same." That line stayed in the air, heavy, sacred. He let it land. He looked down at his hands, the same ones that had pulled his mother to her feet, held her after the confrontation, typed every word of that damning report. They didn't feel like tools. They felt like weapons now, but also like instruments. "Whatever you do," Clara added, "do it loud enough so the silence has to shift." The porch light flicked on above them. Neither moved. The world would wait. And Elijah Jefferson, once just a boy who watched the world dismiss his mother, now held it accountable, with every breath, every decision, every step. The news vans eventually left. The porch signs came down. The hashtags faded from trending. And life in Meadowville, Georgia, resumed its rhythm, slow, measured, familiar. The sound of lawnmowers returned to the mornings. Kids raced bikes through sprinklers on hot afternoons. Dogs barked at delivery trucks again. At first, it felt like the storm had passed, and the town could breathe. But it didn't breathe the same, because something lingered in the stillness. The sidewalk in front of Clara Jefferson's house had been patched and repainted. The white line officers once crossed now looked like any other curb, but those who had watched the footage, who had stood on her lawn with phones and signs, they remembered. The porch remained the same, but different. It creaked like it always had. The rocking chair still moved with the same rhythm, but people noticed it more now. Some even nodded as they passed. A few waved. Most didn't say anything at all. But they walked slower when they passed that house. More deliberately. Because reverence doesn't always announce itself. It just lives in the space between memory and movement. Across town, in grocery stores and barbershops and break rooms, the conversations had changed. Not completely, but enough. Enough for people to ask, why do we code calls that way? Enough for training sessions to include Clara's story, her footage, her name, her porch. At the high school, one teacher assigned a writing prompt titled, "What Stillness Means." One student wrote, "It means you're allowed to exist without defending it." The sheriff's department posted their updated field procedures online. Not everyone read them. Not everyone cared. But the ones who did? They saw the clause that required dispatchers to log every instance where suspicion lacked evidence. They saw the shift. They saw the effort. It wasn't justice, but it was motion. And for Clara, that mattered. Most days, she still sat on that porch, Not to make a statement, not to wait for cameras. Just because it was hers. Because it always had been. Because the world finally catching up didn't mean she needed to move. It was one of those evenings where the sky felt impossibly wide. Blue giving way to gold, gold slipping into rust. The kind of sky that made things feel settled, even if they weren't. Elijah walked up the path, just as the porch light blinked on, automatic and soft. Clara was already there, tea in hand. She didn't say anything when he climbed the steps. She just shifted her weight slightly. The unspoken invitation for him to sit. And he did. For a long moment, they didn't speak. The silence was full, but not heavy, just shared. Then Elijah asked, "Do you think they see you differently now?" Clara didn't answer right away. She took a slow sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle before responding. "See," she said finally. He waited. "Some never will," said Jacqueline. "But now, they don't get to look away." That line settled into him like stone dropped in a well. "They don't get to look away," she repeated, quieter this time. "That's all I ever wanted. Not veil, not frame, just acknowledgement." Elijah leaned back in his chair, hands clasped in his lap. "I keep thinking about everything that's happened," he said. "And sometimes it feels like we shook the world. Other times, like we barely scratched it." Clara nodded. "That's the truth about change. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it echoes later, when you're not even there to hear it." He looked over at her. "And is that enough for you?" She smiled. Not big, not forced, just honest. "I saw myself," she said. "That's what mattered." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. But she explained anyway. "For a long time, I felt like I'd disappeared, like the world moved on without noticing I was still here. But when they tried to erase me off this porch, when they tried to fold me into silence, I stood up, not with my feet, but with my stillness. And I saw myself clearly. I remembered who I was." Elijah nodded, eyes focused on the darkening horizon. "And the world saw you too," he said. Clara's voice turned gentle. "Maybe, or maybe they just couldn't ignore me anymore. Either way, it's not about them." He turned to her. "It's about truth," she said. They sat with that for a while. The hum of cicadas returned, filling the quiet like old hymns. Then Elijah exhaled, deep, final. "I'm staying," he said. Clara didn't react with surprise. She just asked, "You sure?" He nodded. "They offered me something else, more money, bigger title, but I'd have to leave Meadowville. I'd have to be silent again." Clara set her mug down slowly. "You were never made for silence," she said. "I know." She reached over, placing her hand on his. "Then lead, and don't flinch." He squeezed her hand gently, letting her strength travel through him like a current. "I won't," he said. "Good," she whispered, "because they're watching now, and it matters what they see next." Clara leaned back, the wood of the rocking chair groaning beneath her like an old friend speaking. She looked toward the edge of the yard, to the spot where Konsinka had once stood, hand near his holster. She didn't flinch now, but something flickered in her eyes. "You know what's funny?" she said. "All my life, I thought justice would feel like thunder, like drums in the distance, or a crowd roaring at a verdict." Elijah turned slightly, studying her expression. "But it doesn't," she went on. "It feels like this, like porch wood under your feet, like tea cooling in your hands, like the fact that no one dares ask me why I'm sitting here anymore." Elijah smiled, not wide, just grateful. "You gave them silence, Mama," he said, "and they mistook it for permission, but it was resistance the whole time." Clara chuckled. "I wasn't trying to make a point, I was trying to breathe." And they tried to take that too. She nodded, slow and sure. They always want to make our existence a statement, she said. But I wasn't trying to be a headline. I was trying to be human. Elijah's eyes darkened a little. It shouldn't take all this for the world to let you be that. Clara looked at him. But it did. And now that they've seen me, I hope they don't unsee me. He didn't respond right away. The sound of a child laughing in the distance filled the space. Then he asked, "What if it happens again? To someone else? What if this was just a moment, and the next time they don't film fast enough? Or the person isn't lucky enough to have a son in uniform?" Clara didn't hesitate. "Then you make sure that moment echoes. You make it louder. You make it land." She turned to him. "Your job now." He swallowed hard. "I'm scared I'll fail." She reached over, touched his chest lightly. "You already didn't." They stayed that way, the air cooling around them, the dusk folding into night. Elijah leaned back, looking up at the soft glow of the porch light. "I've been in places that run on secrets," he said. "Whole departments that survive by pretending things never happened. But here..." He looked out onto the yard, at the sidewalk, the neighbors' porches, the town that had nearly erased his mother. "Here I wanted to be different. I want Meadowville to remember, to carry this, even when we're not here to remind them." Clara smiled, proud and weary all at once. "We will," she said, "because now they know what it looks like when someone doesn't flinch." He sat still beside her, both of them bathed in the gold of the porch light. And for once, neither of them had to explain why they were there. They just were. Unmoved, unapologetic,